So recently I asked a question on the Facebook page of how people are defining evil without referring back to any particular ideologues, specifically religious tenets or any kind of politicians or policies, anything like that. I think this is a very, very important way to conduct your philosophical thought experiments. Can you define things? Can you define, morals and ethics and everything without referring to some external authority? Can you do this through logic and through science? A lot of that started with years ago. Those of you who know me know this, but those of you who are new may not. Years ago, I was quite religious. I was raised quite religious, and I was actually a volunteer preacher for a while. In fact, that's what ended up leading me to quit religion altogether. That's another story for another time. But during that time, when one of the other men in the congregation was doing a sermon, he had brought up a quote from who's the dude that writes that "Does God Exist?" periodical. Anyway, the quote was, "You cannot have morality without God or without religion." And even as a Christian, even as somebody who was so invested that he was preaching, I felt like that was wrong. I felt like that wasn't the way to go about it. And I couldn't put my finger on it then, but it did kickstart that way of thinking for me. You shouldn't have to refer to an external authority to validate your way of thinking. Now, there's nothing wrong inherently with validation. There is nothing wrong inherently with believing something the same or similar as another person. That's just how life is going to happen on occasion. But by and large, your reasons for believing something can't be because somebody that you like or somebody you trust said so. That is not a reason, right? It's the same thing I tell my students in martial arts. Because Sifu said so is not a reason for doing something a certain way. And it's the same reason for your beliefs. So back to the topic at hand then, when I asked this of people, I got some very interesting answers. I'll put some up on the screen here and there. And when you look at this, one of the things that you would be tempted to conclude is that there's some sort of universality to it. Well, I'm going to disagree with that. Now, we have to be careful, right? The term universal in philosophy, right? When we talk about universals in philosophy, doesn't actually mean that something is scientifically universal, as in it exists in all realms, all scales, whatever, right? Because scientifically speaking, nothing is truly universal. Things that happen on the subatomic scale do not happen the same way on the cosmologic scale, and everything in between. But then you might say, well, hey, humans are all on this one scale. Yes, but there is so much individual variation and there is so much nuance in the details between people. And this is what I want you to notice when you look at some of these answers that people gave. In maybe the big broad stroke, you see a common theme, although not always. And beyond that, what you see is how they're defining things, the nuances, changes radically how you would monitor such behavior within your in-group. And I think this is a very, very important thing. You see, when we talk about things like good and evil, right, these are big abstract concepts. And when we look at abstracts, one of the problems is definitions. How do you define things? And as humans are wont to do, segregating into in-groups as they do within each in-group, and humans can be, of course, part of multiple in-groups, but within each in-group, there are going to be certain standards that are either implicit or explicit, and there are going to be gray zones, and then there's going to be, there are going to be taboos that just do not fly. And the fact is that while, again, you may find similarities in the broad strokes, what you're going to see is the nuances and how those are monitored and policed to a degree is going to be vastly different between the groups, because sometimes 1% makes a difference. In fact, the similarity, the genetic similarity between humans is over 99%. All of the differences we have between individuals, biologically speaking, is less than 1%. It is small. It is very, very, very tiny. And yet, people are so wildly different, right? That should bring up this concept then that nuances matter. And nuances, it's not so much that you need to go and get into semantic arguments, right? Semantics sometimes is necessary and other times is kind of a false flag per se. So then what we end up looking at is the fact that if you can't put things into kind of a universal context, then what do you need to do? You need to be able to define things. And in outlining your definitions, you have to be pretty specific. This is actually one of the reasons, to everybody's chagrin, this is one of the reasons that legal documents are so bloated and overloaded. Like when you look at all of the clauses and everything that lawyers have to draft up for contracts and whatnot, there is a reason they have to go through all of that, because the same thing doesn't mean the same thing to two different people. Our individual differences really, really change how a lot of that ends up working. So then that brings us to the crux of the problem. How do you define what is evil per se? Well, in the real world, you don't really need to. Right? In the real world, what you end up looking at is just kind of standards and practices, right? And what it really needs to come down to is cost versus benefit, right? You take the logical approach and it is a cost versus benefit analysis. And this is probably the crux of my argument here, is you are going to be looking for the things that are more beneficial than costly. If things are more costly than beneficial, unless it is somehow a necessary act of desperation, if things are more costly than beneficial, then those are probably things that you want to try to put a barrier between your in-group and those things. Because while experience of consequences is absolutely necessary, it is such a learning opportunity to experience immediate consequences of your actions. On the other side of it, the thing that we need to look at is the fact that there are some actions that if we can deem them more costly than beneficial, it's not that we remove the consequences from them, we remove the actions as being on the table in the first place because the cost is too great. And so in my opinion, right, there is no evil, there is no good, there's just cost and benefit ratios and how we deem those. Now granted, some things are pretty abstract, and abstract things is often difficult to analyze the costs, and some costs are so far down the road that we kind of misrepresent them as being less costly than they are because the cost is deferred. And those are gray zones that automatically come into the realm of things like arbitration, right? Like no matter how you define good and evil, there are always going to be margins that have to be arbitrated on. You cannot create a system that is going to be so airtight that you can just levy judgment for breaking a rule and that's it. There's always going to be room for arbitration. And that being the case, you're always going to end up dealing with some people disagreeing with the judgment of the arbiter. Now that's talking about it in the real world, right? And because this channel is not just about philosophy, but this channel is also about, crafts and art and storytelling and things like that, where do we find room in our stories for laying out good versus evil, right? Good versus evil is generally kind of simplifying things for children, right? What is the purpose of folktales? Folktales are, it's kind of the pre-literate version of giving people concepts of do's and don'ts and why things, certain things fly and other things don't. They're cautionary, they're warnings. They're also inspiration for people to live better lives, right? So storytelling is not just, writing fancy fiction and, making movies and video games and novels, but it is also part of the human experience, right? And when we look at storytelling, most of what we see is when we see good and evil outlined, it's never really meant to be like a literal this is what evil is. It is a simplification for the sake of painting a picture. It's an illustration. Now we have to be careful, right, that we don't push it into caricature, because as soon as you push it into caricature, it becomes so unbelievable, unrelatable, that it loses all import. Think about the horror movie industry. So much of the horror movie industry is based on the fact that special effects were terrible for so long and these movies were so under budgeted for so long that you just end up with comically bad effects and music and setting and all of that stuff. And so you end up just with stuff that it almost becomes like a subgenre of comedy, right? Well, that's because this stuff is pushed into caricature, right? More blood is not better. At some point, there's a tipping point and it becomes just unbelievable. So it loses the effect of the tale. And so when we look at outlining what good and evil are for the purposes of storytelling, for the purposes of cautionary tales and tales of heroism and things like that, even there where we may have to simplify things for the sake of illustration or for the sake of a younger audience who maybe doesn't have the understanding and experience to grasp the nuance of things, you still have to be careful to not say this is black and white, bad and good. You have to really be more nuanced as to explaining why something is maybe an extreme of a position that would be otherwise okay. A great example is like Magneto from the X-Men. I don't even like the X-Men, but Magneto's such a fantastic villain, right? He's a guy who had just an absolutely tragic backstory, and yet there is nothing about him that makes you want to be sympathetic to him. You can kind of understand why he's traumatized, but he takes that wound, that psychological wound from his early trauma, which is serious and does happen in the real world as well, but he takes that to justify hyper extreme action, violence and racism per se, and all of this stuff. It is understandable and yet wholly unsympathetic. And that is a very, very, very powerful, powerful thing. At no point do you ever look at him and go, I want to reform this guy. No, you sit there and go, no, this guy is done and he needs to be stopped. But at the same time, nobody is, looking at him and saying, this guy is the embodiment of evil. He is a human who has had bad things happen to him and is now enacting bad things as a sort of pendulum swing reaction to the thing. And you can go on down the line. Now, are there people who are just evil for the sake of arbitrarily being evil. I mean, sure, depending on how you're defining things, right? And those kinds of, for lack of a better term, chaotic villains can be useful and engaging as well. In fact, it's not a bad thing to have a character that is just chaotic evil, to use the Dungeons and Dragons term. It's kind of how the Joker has been written for a while, and that is particularly engaging as well. So, I guess the crux of my argument is good and evil don't really exist because universal morality doesn't exist. That being the case, we have to be careful how we define these things, and we have to be specific how we define these things. And if we are speaking or writing or appealing to educated adults, then we have to take the time to say what we mean and say it clearly, even if it's not concise. And if we are writing to or speaking whatever to a younger audience who may have trouble grasping the nuance, then we have to do so in a clear way without going into the realm of caricature and without absolutely demonizing things without justification. So we have to be careful, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to cost versus benefit, and there's always room for arbitration. And it's not a satisfying answer for too many people, but it is just kind of the way it is. And that right there is just another reason to not play these in-group politics of well, we believe this and those guys believe that, and individually you all believe differently too. You're just tolerating each other because you know each other as individuals, and will make exceptions for people that you know and you like and you trust. But as soon as it's somebody that you don't know, like, or trust, you just judge them on the surface, and that's not a useful thing. So I'm done rambling. I think I have said more than what I need to say, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey.